I'm Godfrey Cheshire. I'm very happy to be here talking with Walter Murch and Taghi Amirani about their amazing film, Code 53. I should say to both Taghi and Walter as we get started here that one reason I'm pleased to be doing this is that the Ashland Independent Film Festival is one of my favorite festivals in the U.S. I would say it and Telluride are my two favorite smaller festivals. And since I know you guys started out at Telluride, I think it's very fitting and pleasing to be doing this for Ashland. And, you know, Taghi, I know that you said in your introduction that you're used to getting waves of audience appreciation doing this thing in front of a live audience. And unfortunately, here in the age of the coronavirus, that's not possible. But I'm sure there'll be a lot of enthusiasm from the people watching this film. And so I want to talk about some of the things that that they might be interested in asking after seeing it. I think I'll start sort of at the end and start with the last titles in the film that talk about the sort of the mysteries that still surround Norman Derbyshire and what happened to that interview, et cetera. But let me ask you this. I want to know more about what may have been learned by you guys from the time the film was finished. You know, our mutual friend, Ahmed Kiarostami, who's one of your co-producers, told me about attending a private screening in London in which you had members of the Derbyshire family and the Mossadegh family together. Ahmed said that was rather surreal. Can you give me your own accounts of that?
Yes. That came about because of the level of interest in the film. This happened during the London Film Festival in October. It had programmed officially 2 screenings, which sold out in 5 hours. And so they had to program a 3rd screening, and that sold out in a day, which meant a lot of our friends and extended cast and crew and family couldn't get tickets to see our own film. So we were left with no choice but to hire our own theater during the festival for our own screening to invite whoever we wanted. And this gave us the opportunity of inviting the Mossadegh family, the grandson who features in the film and his brother who lives in London, Humphrey Trevelyan, the End of Empire cameraman who features in the film, he came. Ralph Fiennes came with his team and his assistant and agent, and John le Carré came, who's still obviously still around. Was so mesmerized and impressed by Ralph Fiennes' portrayal of her late husband. She said to us, "That's just like Norman. That's how Norman was." So it worked on so many levels, and including his eldest son coming up to me with a pile of new documents and papers relating to his father, with more stuff that we may get into.
Right. Well, that's so fascinating. And did John le Carré have anything to add to this conversation?
Yes. John le Carré knew Derbyshire. And he confirmed, kind of validated everything the film was trying to do and say. And he said he's not in the least surprised that he was shut down, his interview disappeared, or he wasn't allowed to see the light of day. That seemed to him pretty standard practice. And we have some ideas of talking to him further about what might come next in the post-release sort of life of the film.
It was also, he made some comments, as I remember it, about how ex-MI6 agents lived in fear of having their pension taken away from them or being shut down. Clearly, in the case of Derbyshire, he just, he let it rip. But there was, according to John le Carré, this endemic fear and suspicion of not rocking the boat.
Right. You know, something that Ahmed also said to me was that, you know, in the film, it talks about why Derbyshire would have done this. And the main thing that's cited is the idea that he thought Kermit Roosevelt was getting too much of the credit, or the Americans got too much of the public, credit, if you want to call it credit, for the coup. And he wanted to sort of set the record straight. But Ahmed said that there was also an element in the way that he was dealt with, was that he was different from most of the other people in MI6, and that he was not an Oxbridge upper class guy. He was a different type of character. Is that right? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Walter?
Yeah, he went to Iran at the age of 19 in 1943 as a private. And just because of his personality, a young, enterprising man, he learned how to speak Farsi, Persian, and learned to navigate the street, so to speak. And as a result of this, he rose very quickly in the army. At that time, Iran was being used as a conveyor belt to get military equipment from the Persian Gulf up into the Soviet Union. And he was instrumental in this. And when the war ended, he, after having been promoted within the army, he became part of MI6, or the MI6's forerunner. And he became the go-to guy. When the Oxbridge people wanted something to happen, they would call on him to know which strings should be pulled. And as a result of that, he kept rising up and up until the crisis happened in 1953. And that's what the story of the film takes over at that point. But yes, he was, as far as we know, he never went to university, and he was not, his father was a grocer or something, but you know, he was not part of the world of the people who ultimately were working for him.
Right, and that might have had something to do with how he was handled after all of this, right? That he might have had a certain resentment around the way that he was treated that led him to give this interview. Is that possible?
Well, I think there's a lot of speculation, and I'm aware of the fact that our filmmaker's imagination could build a lot of scenarios of what exactly happened. My mind goes to, he might have done something even bigger and more controversial than the Iranian coup, and there might be other things in his skeletons in his cupboard. He definitely stood out as being different. The fact that he gave this interview gives you a sense of his character. He kind of didn't care. He went rogue. But
right.
in Iran, he had street smarts. In fact, there's a lot of stuff in the transcript that we couldn't put in the film, but you get a picture of how he operated. And he specifically says in a sentence, whilst the ambassador was having cocktail parties at the embassy, I was on the streets talking to the people. He really knew the kind of the Iranian character. He had the pulse of the street. And that goes hand in hand with him going rogue and giving this interview, whether to settle scores or whether to claim credit. There's definitely a lot in having to redress the balance of credit from taking it away from Kermit and give it back to the man who actually did pull the whole thing off. This was his plan. He was the man who laid the groundwork. Kermit was only in Iran for 3 weeks. He didn't speak Turkish.
Derbyshire was one of the two people who wrote the whole plan out that was then rubber stamped by Churchill and Eisenhower. So it was his
right?
baby.
Yeah. Well, just to follow up on the question of, have you learned things since the film was completed that you think are important to the story now? Have you clarified anything about Derbyshire or any other issues that you think make important postscripts to what's in the film?
Well, we made contact with the family. We found his daughter almost in the 11th hour in the post-production. We have a photograph in the film that we zoom in and say, this is Derbyshire. Well, we only got that photograph confirmed in the final months of the edit. In fact, the online was waiting for us to be able to confirm that. We found the family, we found the daughter, which led to everyone seeing the film and that amazing screening in London where new documents were brought to us. And we've met other people in the family and friends until Corona hit. We were in the process of making a short sequel. I was filming stuff, new scenes in what we called a sort of a sequel, a short sequel all about Derbyshire to Coup 53, and we jokingly called it Coup 53.1. And I don't want to give away too much of the incredible new stuff that we found, because that could still be potentially a new project, or take some form. We don't know. I mean, we don't know how things will shape. Is the modus operandi for this entire film? We just didn't know, and we just went with the flow. And this is a part of the same process.
Well, it's interesting that you're talking about maybe a little sequel, and I hope that the Ashland Festival will be able to let the viewers of this film know about that if it's, if you're offering it at some point. So it's going to be interesting. And it's obviously a story that has many dimensions to it, and you've been pursuing it for 10 years, Taghi, but there's more to come, I would certainly think, as you both continue working on the story. I wanted to get to this. I've been to Iran 7 times. I've been there a lot over the last 20 years. And when I first went, I first heard this story, and I knew it was obviously so important to a lot of Iranians. One thing that I observed that was kind of interesting to me very early on was that people in Iran seem to really welcome Americans and really like Americans. And yet they're very suspicious of British people. And they're the only nationality that seems to really get a lot of negativity from Iranians. And the more I learn about all of this, the more that kind of makes sense. I mean, I think that if you talk to Iranians, that I did a lot about this whole coup, a lot of them think it was basically the British that set it all up. And it was all about the nationalization of the oil, and that they just sort of got the Americans to come along with them. And it wasn't like American perfidiousness. It was British perfidiousness with American help. And so that's very interesting to me. It is in part because, when I was hearing this story, like reading about it outside of Iran, I was hearing Kermit Roosevelt. And I think you have provided a really necessary corrective to that in this. And it's going to change the historical record, I think, for sure. Have you guys talked to historians? I mean, Stephen Kinzer is obviously in the film and is great, but other historians about how this can reshape the perception of this event?
Yeah, a lot of good, interesting points. That for Iranians, there's never been any doubt that the British were behind this. Iran and Britain have known each other in a very, I was going to love-hate. I think Iranians love to hate the British because of their reputation of what they've been up to in Iran going back, over 2 centuries. So there was never a doubt for them. In fact, there's a joke that Iranians think everything that happens in Iran is because of the British. Now that's the exaggerated conspiracy theory. Like even if it rains, the British were behind it. But the idea that there's no smoke without fire holds true in this case. And in terms of the redressing the balance with Kermit, yes, we've now essentially revised the history of how the story of the coup is told. Malcolm Byrne, who is the deputy director and head of research at the NSA, came to the New York premiere or New York preview screening of the film. And he said, we're going to have to rethink this particular chapter. We're going to have to rethink how we tell this, because you guys have brought new information to light, and history does have to be revised. And Stephen Kinzer attended a screening. He actually moderated the Q&A, and he was surprised by the weight of the Derbyshire story in relation to Kermit's part in the story.
Yes, because his book is subtitled "The American Coup to Overthrow," whatever. It's like it's all America. It's all CIA. It's not. It should at least be Anglo-American, right?
Yeah.
But Walter, let me ask you. You came into this several years after Taghi got going on it. When you came into it, and you told in your introduction how that happened, what did you see as the main challenges about how the story should be told and how you could contribute to that?
I think there were 3 things that emerged pretty quickly. One of them was, who's telling this story? What's the point of view of this? Because as you know, and anybody who knows anything about this coup knows it's very contentious subject matter, and you can get into big arguments that are evocative of the kind of arguments that people got into after the Russian Revolution. So it was pretty clear to me that Taghi had to step forward and say, "This is my story. You know, I'm telling this story." Otherwise, to say that we were going to put together a God's eye point of view on it would be problematical, because then who is God? You know, what's the basis of this? So the fact that Taghi was born in Iran, spent 15 years of his first 15 years of his life in Iran, and then left Iran before the revolution, 1975, 76, and has British citizenship. So he knows both sides of the equation and has spent a lot of time in the United States too. So I thought that was very important. And then the other thing was it just flew out of my head.
Bringing Iranian voices to the film itself, giving a lot of documentaries have been made for television, mainly, in fact, all for television, which essentially go to the usual suspects.
Right.
But bringing Iranian witnesses and participants and witnesses and finding new voices, new voices and new archive material were
And I just remembered the coup is known by historians and by interested people who wonder what's going on out there. So we had to make a film that appealed both to people who knew about the coup and also make it understandable to people who didn't know anything about the coup.
Yeah.
And when we were working out the story structure on these little colored cards that you see in the film, one of them was a black card with a gold X on it, which is what the mysterious thing that we may discover in making this film that will help us bridge the film between those two audiences, people who don't know anything about it and then are learning, and then people who knew about the coup who might feel, yeah, I know all about it, but obviously that X turned into Norman Derbyshire, that he was this wonderful prize that in a sense almost fell into our laps in the last couple of years of making the film.
Right. Well, it is really impressive and fascinating how you interweave the interviews you shot with the interviews from that were shot back in the 80s, I guess it was, for the End of Empire series, because those dovetail and mesh very, very well. And I think Taghi, you did a good job of finding people that you could interview now. For instance, even someone as disagreeable as Ardashir Zahedi, to talk about these things in a pretty frank way, you know? So, I mean, it's a fascinating document that tells this story in a great way. You know, I'm curious about, you said that when you set out trying to find backing for the film, you didn't get it from any of the institutional sources you went to. I assume that those, since you're based in Britain, some of those were British. And was there resistance to the idea of telling the story? Is this story still kind of supposed to be under wraps and the TV stations there don't want to show it? And has there been the same kind of reaction to the finished film?
I could one day write the classic New Yorker essay about why this didn't get funded. There are a lot of reasons, and they play along each other. The funding issues were multifaceted. One is, why do we care about a story that happened 66 years ago, and it's going to be an old story, it's going to be black and white archive, and it's going to be lots of people with subtitles. It's not going to sell. I mean, that's on the surface, that could be one reason. Okay. There is no British money in this film, you're right. Even your progressive liberal Brits, or for want of a better phrase, are lefty friends of ours. When it comes to issues to the Middle East, their perspective is not quite the same. I would like to argue that a lot of new liberals are chattering classes in the UK paved the way and facilitated the invasion of Iraq, and they facilitated the invasion of Afghanistan. When it comes to us going over there, we're all the same. We all speak the same same language. I think the funding issue actually worked in our favor. The luxury of time gave us the opportunity to find the stuff that we found. As Walter said, we found the Derbyshire material only in the last 2 years. The fact that we talk about a film in the last 2 years, when most films probably only take 2 years, 3 years to make. Yeah. We were researching and shooting and fundraising constantly for the 10 years, 4 years of which Walter was working on the film editing. And when the shutdowns came, they played in our favor. It gave us time to go through thousands and thousands of pages of documents and listen to hundreds of hours of audio tape. Those Mossad speeches, there's so much of it we had to listen to, and footage that we had to spool through. So when I talk about the lack of funding support, I no longer speak of it with resentment. I am grateful to everybody who turned us down. Thank you for turning us down. Had they not turned us down, we wouldn't have taken so long to make this film and finish it, and we wouldn't have found what we have. So, they gave us lemons and we made lemonade.
Right. Well, as far as official culture goes, there's a difference between the U.S. and Britain, in that the U.S. has the Freedom of Information Act and Britain has the Official Secrets Act. And they tend to keep things under wraps, at least as far as the government can influence things. And so I was wondering if you perceived any government influence on TV channels they're not giving you backing or whatever, or was this just more a commercial decision on their part?
I don't know. I mean, let's give them the benefit of a doubt. I was pitching something pretty nebulous. It's like, mainly because TV documentaries about this subject have been made. There are at least 2 or 3 British TV documentaries made about this. They fall into the standard history documentary, voice of God narration, archive, often the same people being interviewed. So maybe to their mind was, what's the point of doing this? And what's the point of doing this as a cinematic feature-length movie? I began the film, I begin all my films purely on an instinct or on a kind of a gut feeling or kind of a gut reaction. And all I could say, I just want to do this because I feel there's something to be said. I feel there are people who haven't spoken, and I just feel. That's all I've got to tell you. And maybe they don't want to put money into a feeling. They want something more concrete. Right. That's one thing. I mean, there was a studio. I can't talk about the studio. It was a studio who came in, a Hollywood studio. And when they found out about my method of working, which is feel your way around, and if you find something, go for it. You don't have to. If I find somebody amazing who's in their 90s, I just go and film them. I don't wait for permission or plans, because the guy could not be with us that long, And the idea that this was this slightly rogue director who has this nebulous idea and is doing things his way is a risk, probably. Now we can see the risk has paid off, but at the time they couldn't see that.
Right. I think we're about to use up our time, so let me wrap this up with one question. Has the film been shown in Iran, and have you had reactions from Iranians about what you've been doing with this?
Not yet. We were about to submit the film to film festivals in Iran. In fact, we had an invitation on the opening day of Telluride. I had an invitation from Cinema Verite Film Festival in Iran, which is the biggest documentary festival.
Yes.
But what we want to do is do the Persian subtitles ourselves, because I'm very particular about giving the exact right spirit of everything that everyone says in Persian, rather than outsource the subtitling. And once that version is ready, we're working on it right now, we will definitely look into a festival screening. General theatrical release, as you know, in Iran, that's under government control. A permit for theatrical screening has to go from the government, and we don't know how that will play out. Iranians who've seen the film outside Iran at various screenings in San Francisco, LA, Chicago, London, have loved it. The one place I thought it may not go down too well in LA, essentially kind of not entirely, but basically a royalist town.
Yeah.
We had a standing ovation twice. So just goes to show you don't know anything until you try it.
Right. And we're in such a strange period now with this coronavirus, but beyond the festivals like Ashland, do you have any expectation or plans about how the film will be more broadly seen, either theatrically or on television?
We are in discussions with distributors. Let me just be straight about this. The same challenges that we faced in getting the film made and funded, we faced in getting it distributed. It doesn't surprise me. I've become pretty philosophical about that. I think any setback, including the virus, is probably playing in our favor in ways we haven't imagined yet. There are a lot of festivals. We had some 22 festivals to go to. My travel itinerary was pretty packed until July. Now it's empty. It's now filled with Zooms. So we are hopeful to get this in theaters in the UK and the US soon, as soon as the virus lifts. We're working on that.
Well, good luck, and I know that the audience there in Ashland is going to feel very privileged to have seen this, and it's a privilege to me to talk to both of you about it. So good luck with the future course of the film.
Thank you very much, Godfrey. Nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk to both of you. Goodbye.